I let my wife's parents use our backyard for a garden. Nothing big, just a few raised beds, some tomatoes, maybe herbs. A year later, I wasn't even allowed to step on the grass. My wife looked me in the eye and said, "It's their space now." I walked outside that morning and saw a wooden sign stuck into the dirt that read, "Private property," in my own yard. I pulled it out of the ground, stood there for a minute, took a deep breath, and that's when I realized things had gone way too far. My name's Eric, I'm 42, and I've lived in Eugene, Oregon for most of my life. I'm not someone who usually gets rattled, but even now this story still messes with my head. I married Carrie 11 years ago. She was warm, patient, and funny in a quiet way. We were steady, no chaos, no games. We bought a modest home with a little backyard, just enough for a barbecue, 2 chairs, and a patch of grass for our dog, Baxter. We didn't have kids. That was a choice. We both worked full-time and enjoyed our peace, at least we used to. Everything shifted last year when her parents, Dale and Marlene, came into the picture. It started small. One phone call. Carrie said they were thinking of selling their house in Klamath Falls and wanted to be closer to us. I had no idea what was coming next. It started with a phone call last spring. Sarah said her parents were thinking of selling their house in Klamath Falls and wanted to be closer to us. Just for a while, she said. A few weeks, maybe a couple months tops. They'd crash in the guest room until they found a new place. I wasn't thrilled, but I agreed. I mean, family helps family, right? So, in late March, Robert and Linda showed up with a moving truck full of boxes and furniture that barely fit through our front door. Robert's in his 70s, one of those guys who has an opinion on everything, how you mow your lawn, how you grill chicken, which cable news channel you should watch. He's the kind of man who starts every sentence with, "You know what your problem is?" Linda, on the other hand, is softer spoken, but don't let that fool you. She's sharp. Always watching, always keeping score. She'd smile while rearranging our spice rack like it was her kitchen. I let the little things slide at first. I bit my tongue when Robert scoffed at how I trimmed the hedges, or when Linda reorganized the pantry and tossed out all the sauces I liked. I figured they'd be gone soon. We just needed to ride it out. Then, maybe 5 or 6 weeks in, Linda asked if they could use a corner of the backyard to plant a small garden. Said it'd keep them busy, get them some fresh air, maybe even help us save on groceries. I didn't think twice. I don't care about vegetables. I said sure. I even helped Robert build the raised beds using leftover wood from a shed project. We spent a Saturday digging up the sod and hauling in soil. He actually seemed to enjoy himself. For a moment, it even felt like we were bonding. Like maybe this wouldn't be as bad as I thought. The garden grew fast. Tomatoes, lettuce, peppers, squash. It took over that entire corner. Robert started referring to it as my garden. I didn't correct him. No big deal. Then more plants showed up, then trellises, sprinklers, even a compost bin Linda installed without asking. Our yard, which used to be simple and open, slowly turned into something I didn't recognize. I started feeling like a guest in my own home. By midsummer, Robert and Linda were outside every single day. Not just tending the garden, but lounging out there like it was their private space. They brought out folding chairs, citronella candles, a Bluetooth speaker. I walked out one afternoon to water a plant on the patio, and Robert actually asked me to not walk across his grass while he was fertilizing. I blinked, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. I laughed it off, but that stuck with me. A few days later, I came home from work and saw a wooden sign staked in the yard near the garden beds. It read, "Private property. Please do not enter." I thought maybe someone in the neighborhood had put it there as a prank. But no, Robert had made it himself. Sanded edges, painted letters, the whole deal. When I asked about it, Sarah just said they've worked hard on it, it's their space now. I stood there in disbelief. My yard, my house, my name on the mortgage, and apparently I had to ask permission to walk through the grass I mowed every Sunday. That's when things started to crack. I began noticing how different the house felt, how quiet Sarah got when I brought up boundaries, how tense dinners became when I mentioned timelines or real estate listings. I'd say something like, "Hey, has your dad looked into that senior apartment complex?" And she'd change the subject. When I brought up how they were treating the yard like it was theirs, she said I was being dramatic, said I was making things uncomfortable. But what about how uncomfortable I felt? What about how I had to tiptoe around the kitchen because Linda took over our grocery list and meal planning without even asking? She'd leave notes on the fridge, "No more almond milk, Robert prefers 2%, as if that was her call. Every corner of our home was slowly being claimed, like we were in a land war I didn't sign up for. I stopped using the backyard altogether. It didn't feel like mine anymore. One evening, I saw Robert giving someone a tour over the fence, talking about his irrigation setup, showing off the compost, bragging about the yield. He didn't mention me once. Didn't nod toward the house, didn't acknowledge the fact that he was standing on my land. I walked outside just to be present, just to remind him I still existed. He barely looked at me. Said, "Be careful, we just treated the grass." We, like I was the outsider. That was the moment it hit. Methus wasn't temporary anymore. This wasn't a short stay until they got on their feet. They had no plans of leaving. They weren't guests, they were settlers. And I was just standing there, watching them build a life on top of mine. By midsummer, their little garden wasn't just a weekend hobby anymore. It had turned into a full-scale backyard takeover. What started with 2 simple raised beds had now tripled in size. They added more wooden frames, started building makeshift fencing to keep Max out, and even bought one of those cheap half-comacid plastic greenhouses from Home Depot. I stood at the window one day just watching it all, wondering when our backyard stopped being a backyard and started becoming their personal farm. I thought, okay, whatever, maybe they just needed something to focus on, let them have their tomatoes. But things started getting weird fast. Linda began yelling at Max anytime he even sniffed the edge of a garden bed. He's a dog, our dog, in his own yard. She'd shoo him away like he was some stray mutt trespassing on their private land. Then Robert started giving me instructions, literal instructions on how to water plants. One Saturday I grabbed the hose, like I've done for years, and went to help, only for Robert to snap, "We don't do it that way." I froze. We? It's my hose, my water, my lawn. But suddenly, I was the outsider here. It kept building. Every time I tried to set a boundary, Sarah would take their side. I'd say something like, "Max should be able to run around out back without getting yelled at," and she'd respond with, "Just let them have their space, James. It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal. This wasn't a public park. This was our yard, the one we picked together when we bought this house. The one we said would be our peaceful little retreat. It started to feel like the walls were closing in, like there was no corner of my life they hadn't touched. Then, in early fall, Robert crossed another line. He bought a prefab shed online, had it delivered, and just set it up in the far corner of the yard like it was nothing. No heads up, no, "Hey James, is it cool if I throw up a structure on your land?" Just one day. There's a shed filled with rakes, seed packets, and what looked like a half-broken blender. I brought it up, tried to be calm, and said we'd need to move it before winter storms hit. He shrugged and said, "We'll deal with it later." Winter came, the shed stayed. So did everything else. The little solar lights they stuck into the ground, the cheap plastic gnome statues lining the garden path, the rusty wheelbarrow that leaned against the fence for weeks. It was like they'd claimed this space and now expected us to live around it. Then came January. I got home from work one night and saw a new addition sign nailed to a post, standing near the garden beds, plain as day. It read, "Please keep out." No names, no explanation, just a rule. In my own backyard. I brought it inside and showed Sarah, half expecting her to say something like, "Okay, that's too far." But instead she just laughed and said, "Dad's just being protective of the plants." I didn't find it funny. "We can't joke about territory in our own yard," I told her. She rolled her eyes and changed the subject. That's when I realized she didn't just tolerate their behavior, she defended it. And that made everything worse. By spring, I was barely using the backyard at all. It didn't feel like mine. They kept expanding, creeping further across the grass like ivy on a brick wall. Robert built a bench under a DIY trellis, lined it with climbing vines, and called it a meditation spot. I overheard Linda on the phone one day telling someone it was her sanctuary. On my land, in my life. I was losing track of how many days passed where I tiptoed through the house, just trying to avoid another passive-aggressive comment or a guilt trip about being too sensitive. It didn't feel like home anymore. I didn't feel like I had a voice. They weren't house hunting. They weren't checking listings. There were no weekend drives or open house flyers. They weren't leaving. They were digging in. And the worst part, Sarah let them. Then came the morning that broke me. It was early April, the kind of morning where the sky is just starting to turn pink and everything feels still. I let Max out and stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, hoping for a moment of peace. That's when I saw it. A new wooden post in the backyard, driven deep into the ground, screwed in, painted carefully, a bold black sign, private property, do not enter. I didn't move at first, I just stared at it. My stomach dropped. I walked over, touched it like maybe I was imagining things, but no, it was real, sturdy, clear, deliberate. My hands shook as I yanked it out of the dirt. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't gardening anymore. This was a full-on power play. A line drawn in the soil. And I wasn't invited to cross it. I brought the sign into the kitchen, laid it right in the middle of the table, and waited. When Sarah came home, she saw it and raised her eyebrows. "You pulled it out?" she asked, like I was the one who had done something wrong. "What is this, Sarah?" I asked. "Private property? In our backyard?" She sighed, rubbed her forehead. "It's just Dad feeling like he has a place. You know how he is." "No," I said. "I don't know how he is, and I don't care. That's our yard. I never signed it over to anyone." She crossed her arms. "You've been so controlling. You never cared about the backyard until they started using it. Now suddenly you're obsessed," and that's when it hit. This wasn't about plants or space. This was about control, territory, and the fact that I no longer had any. That night I barely slept. I stared out the window, watching Robert walk the perimeter of his garden, checking where the sign used to stand, shaking his head like I had overstepped. The next morning I called a lawyer. I needed to know where I stood legally. That same afternoon, Sarah asked if I was okay. I told her, "We need to talk about who actually runs this house." Her tone flipped. "It's not a dictatorship, James, and it's not a democracy where your parents get a vote," I shot back. She walked away, no words, just silence. At 9 a.m. the next day, Robert walked into the kitchen like it was his office, poured himself a cup of coffee from my pot, and sat down like we were in some kind of negotiation. "James," he said, calm as ever, "we've clearly had a breakdown in communication." I stared straight at him. "No, Robert, we've had a breakdown in respect." He leaned back, smug. "You need to understand, we've put time and money into that garden. It's special. It deserves boundaries." "It's not your land," I said. "You don't make the rules here." He smirked. "You keep saying your land, but Sarah invited us. She told us the backyard's shared now, a family space." I froze. "What are you talking about?" He looked me in the eye and said, "It means we're not going anywhere, and we're not giving up that garden. You need to accept that." I laughed, cold, sharp. I walked out to the garage, grabbed the deed from the fireproof box, and dropped it on the kitchen table. My name. Only mine. "This is who owns this house," I said. "Not you, not Sarah. Me." He didn't even look down. He just said, "You'll regret this." That night, Sarah told me the truth. "They gave us 60 grand last fall," she said, "from the sale of their house." I put it toward the mortgage. I stared at her. "You used their money? On my house? Without telling me?" She shrugged. "It's our house. I did what was best for us." My stomach turned. That's when I realized this wasn't about support or family. It was a quiet, calculated takeover. I called a different lawyer the next morning. His name was Michael Stone. We didn't file for divorce yet, but I needed options. 2 days later, I came home to find Robert out back with 2 strangers, one holding blueprints, the other measuring the space near the fence. I stormed out. "What's going on?" I asked. Robert smiled. "Just brainstorming, thinking about a pergola, maybe a little water feature." "You're not building anything on my property," I snapped. Sarah appeared on the patio. "I approved it," she said. I turned to her. "You went behind my back?" "Again?" She shook her head. "You've turned this place into a war zone, James. I'm done asking." That night, I packed a bag, grabbed Max, and checked into a hotel. I needed space. I needed clarity. The next day, I came back to grab a few things and found Robert sitting at my laptop. "What are you doing?" I barked. He looked up casually. "Just looking for the backyard plat." I slammed the lid shut. "That's my computer." "You don't touch it." "You left it open." I stepped closer. "You're in my house. On my device. You've crossed every line." He smirked again. "If you keep pushing, Sarah's going to walk. And she'll have our full support in court." That was the moment I knew this wasn't just a boundary issue. This was war. And I wasn't going to keep playing defense. I went straight back to Michael. We changed the locks, froze shared accounts, moved the house title into a trust under my name only. Then Sarah hit back with legal papers. Not a divorce filing, but a petition for co-ownership of the house, claiming her parents' 60 grand gave them a stake. They weren't just taking over the yard, they were coming for everything. But I wasn't going down. I was done watching. I was done reacting. Now, I was setting the trap. Michael and I got to work immediately. We filed a motion to block the co-ownership, and since the house was mine before the marriage, we had the proof. Every document, every timestamp, every payment record was on my side. We also sent a cease and desist letter to Robert and Linda, officially naming them as trespassers. Thanks to our Ring cameras, we had footage of Robert building without permits, sneaking onto my laptop, and literally calling my yard his land. It wasn't just petty anymore, it was unlawful. We added a countersuit for damages and emotional distress, tied to their unauthorized use of my property and Sarah's secret move with the 60 grand. I also called Sarah's sister, Emily, who lives in Bend. We hadn't spoken much, but she knew what I was dealing with. Turns out, Robert and Linda had pulled something similar on her. Years ago, move it into her basement, overstayed and refused to leave until she got legal help. She was more than willing to back me up. She gave us her legal paperwork and a signed statement. This wasn't some one-off mess, it was a pattern. In court, Sarah and Robert acted like they had it in the bag. Calm, smug, like the judge was just a formality. But Michael laid everything out like a sledgehammer. Mails, receipts, video footage, text messages, voice recordings. He played a clip of Sarah on a call with a friend saying, "We've taken over the backyard, James doesn't realize it yet." That one made the judge's eyebrows shoot up. He flipped through our documentation, saw Sarah never disclosed the 60 grand, never filed a gift agreement, and once Emily's statement came in about the same behavior years earlier, the tide turned hard. The ruling was clear and fast. Sarah's petition was denied. The $60,000 deemed a gift, not an investment. Sarah was given 30 days to pack up and move out. Robert and Linda were issued a no trespass order. One step onto my land again, and they'd be arrested on the spot. I walked out of that courtroom breathing deeper than I had in months. That night I came home and stood in the middle of the yard. Their shed, the half-built pergola, the garden beds, the gnome army, it all just sat there like a ghost town, like a reminder of how close I came to losing everything I built. The next morning I hired a demolition crew. By noon, the raised beds were gone. By 2 p.m., the shed had been knocked down. The pergola frame was reduced to splinters. The gnomes smashed into pieces and thrown in the dumpster. The private property sign, I tossed it in the fire pit, lit it, and watched the flames curl around Robert's name, which I'd written across the wood in thick black Sharpie. I sold the scrap wood and leftover fencing on Facebook Marketplace for $2,300. Then, I donated every dollar to a local animal shelter in Robert's name, tax receipt and all. A week later, Sarah came by to collect her things. She looked around at the cleared-out yard, at the fresh dirt and empty corners, and just said, "Why'd you go this far?" I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Because I let you all take too much for too long. This is my house. Not yours, not theirs, mine." She didn't cry, just nodded and said, "You'll be alone forever." I smiled. Better alone than overrun, and that was the last time I saw her. 6 months later, Max and I are still here, just the two of us. I built a new deck where the shed used to be, nothing huge, just a small space for a grill, a chair, and a place for Max to lay in the sun. No gnomes, no signs, no rules written by someone else. Every evening I step outside, crack open a cold beer, and breathe in the quiet. No fighting, no silent tension in the hallway, just stillness, real peace, and I promise you, no one is ever taking that from me again. So if you've ever felt like a guest in your own life, like someone else was rewriting the rules in your home, just know this: it's never too late to take your space back. You don't need to yell or beg to be heard. Sometimes the quietest thing you can do is choose yourself and mean it. Let me know in the comments, if you ever had to reclaim something that was yours. Your space, your peace, your power. I read every single one, and if this story hit home, hit subscribe and check out the next one. You're not selfish for setting boundaries. You're just done being stepped on.